This is part of our 150th anniversary celebration that the first of the month we get to hear memories from our church, and Pastor Diann Smith has agreed to share with us her memories of this church. Thank you, Diann.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Diann Smith, and I will be 75 years old this year. So I was 9 years old when we broke ground for this church, and 11 years old when it was dedicated. I just have flashes of memories of the old church, so I state my disclaimer now that these are my memories of how it was and not necessarily how it really was. Coming in from South Potomac Street, you would need to climb a long flight of stairs to the left or to the right to get to the sanctuary on the second floor. Many people had difficulty getting up to the church services. The elderly and the handicapped, people with small children in tow, musicians with their instruments. Straight ahead from the entry was the equivalent of our fellowship hall, where banquets were held and Sunday school took place. There was a grassy area outside the side door from the Sunday school rooms, and I can remember being reminded many times to get up off the ground in my good church clothes. I don't have many more images of that old church except the feeling of anticipation that was thick in the air as people raised funds and made plans in eagerness of what was to come. Many times we would leave church to ride out here to see what progress was being made. I can remember walking up to the edge of the foundation and looking down into a really, really big hole into what is now Fellowship Hall, and then looking all the way up to the ceiling in the sanctuary. It was bigger than life to me, and I felt like I was looking down into the Grand Canyon. Seeing the plans come to life was exciting, but it felt like it was taking forever. Attending special occasions like the groundbreaking or the laying of the cornerstone and the raising of the steeple were all thrilling. But at 10 years old, I did not have an appreciation of how enduring and meaningful all these things would be when I was 75. Building this beautiful building was a learning experience, and there were things that were changed and tweaked over the years. You probably never noticed, but the hallway past the elevator and the first aid room was quite narrow, and there was constantly a log jam of people trying to get through that space. Part of the upper tower room, where the visitor center is, was outside and was originally intended to be part of the front porch, and that was to be the front door of the church. There was another entry door where the visitor center sits now. If you look closely, the slate floor is pieced together where the original wall ended. We have made many more adjustments to our church building as our needs have changed. But I was not interested in the structure of the church. I have always had the feeling that the people made the church, and the church people are my extended family. When my grandfather married my grandmother around 1920 or so, he brought her to this church. Their names were John and Agnes Hamburg, and they raised their 5 Hamburg children in this church. My mother was Lorraine, the second child and their first daughter. All my aunts and uncles loved this church dearly and were active in many of the functions of the church. My Uncle John Hamburg was the teacher of the Ever Ready Sunday School class for a long time, and my Uncle Don Hamburg was an elder and a board member. My mother was an elder and the superintendent of the senior high school Sunday school department, and she taught for many years with Patsy Reginald. My father was Harold Carey. He was a deacon and served on the property committee and was involved in much of the maintenance and changes to the building. My sister Donna and I were raised in this church along with our 8 cousins. Donna and I reminisced as I was writing this and have many good memories. Could we consider this a confessional for just a moment? We both remember one Sunday when we met in the lower hallway on our way to Sunday school. We decided we had sat still long enough. So instead of going to Sunday school, the cousins escaped with our offering coins and walked down to the shopping center where there was a People's Drugstore. We had just the right amount of money to each buy a candy bar and ate it as we walked back to the church. We got back just in time for Sunday school to be getting over, so we waited for our parents to pick us up in that lower hallway. They were never any the wiser until, as adults, we confessed to what we had done. Our parents were so surprised to be hearing that story for the first time after all those years. Many people come to mind as I think back. I remember fondly Herman Stockslager. He was my Sunday school teacher in the junior department, and I was in awe of him. He stood in that front north corner of the balcony every Sunday to count the number of people in attendance. After church, I would find him and say, "How many?" The number meant nothing to me. I had no concept whether that was a lot or a few, but what meant the most to me was that personal contact. When he saw me coming, he gave me a jolly, welcoming smile. He was a hard-working man, and when I sat in his class, I was fascinated by his hands. They were the biggest, strongest hands I had ever seen, and they were as kind and gentle as they could be. To me, he was the epitome of a gentle giant. Mr. Frank McKee and Joellen McKee were teachers in that class as well. Thanks for the memories. When I think of the kitchen and all the good food that came out of there, I think of Mary Jane Bonebreak. When I think of being in worship and sitting with my grandmother and Pappy, I think of Claude Poole always sitting in front of them. One Sunday, Grandma was standing in the narthex talking with her friends, and Mr. Poole came up to her and said, "Would you please go sit down? I don't know where to sit if you're not in your pew." I can still see Harry May standing in the back by the center doors, greeting everyone as they left worship. He and his wife Grace loved everyone they ever met, and their generosity was unsurpassed. I think of my contemporaries who will always be the kids with me: Tom and Sue Hogeville, Pam and Beth Kunkelman, Jan and Sue Matthews, Mary Rosalie Morgan, Gary Kidwell, Dave Fryer, Bob and John McKee. The list goes on and on. Being part of a large church family, it was hard to get away with anything. Everywhere I looked, there was someone I knew or someone who knew me. One person I remember was Patsy Johnson. She was in my parents' Sunday school class, but she was also a substitute school teacher. Anytime she showed up, she was quick to remind us, "Remember, I know your mother." I see our precious children come forward on Sunday mornings, and I pray that this church that we serve will serve them and mean as much to them when they are 75. Amen.